Does everybody have their practice test? If you do not, I have a few. Anybody not have their practice test? You do not? That's okay. I have a copy of it. Anybody else not have the practice test? Well, this is nice having this microphone. You know the questions I want to do tonight? There are none that I guess we could say we went over, but go to 71. Let's see what 71 is. Okay, this is actually related to what we had talked about. I may have mentioned this. A key diplomatic achievement of Richard Nixon's presidency was a nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union, the signing of the Camp David Accords, a joint Apollo-Soyuz space mission with the Soviet Union, a visit to Angola to help the African nation resist communist guerrillas, a visit to China in February of 1972. Now, we did kind of mention something about that. Anybody have any idea? Yes. Yes. Nixon went to China in 72. And I just wanted to reinforce that because we did say that in the aftermath of China falling to communism in 49, the United States did not recognize communist China, Red China as it was called, as China. Chiang Kai-shek's forces fled in 49 when the communists took over the country. Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist, his forces fled to the island of Formosa. And that island of Formosa became known as Taiwan, or nationalist China. It still exists. Taiwan, or nationalist China, still exists. Until 1973, I think. I don't know when we formally recognized them. 73 or 74, but Nixon was president, right? Until that time, we didn't recognize China. We didn't have diplomatic relations. Nixon starts it in 72 by visiting China. You know, he opened diplomacy. And Nixon could get away with it because he was considered to be hard on communism. He had a very strong anti-communist kind of background. So Nixon was generally considered to have very strong foreign affairs. I mean, he got into trouble, you know, with domestic affairs and his paranoia, but he had very strong foreign affairs. 73. Now, 73, remember I told you the other day, it says rock and roll of Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and the Rolling Stones derived primarily from European folk music, unlikely. 19th century American ballads, unlikely. Cowboy songs, unlikely. African American rhythm and blues is the likely answer. And I told you the other day, I said, you know, they always ask a kind of cultural question like that, which is somewhat obvious. I mean, if you read through that, you don't really know. But it's somewhat obvious that the correct answer is D. But it actually is in your book. There's actually a little section, I was reading it this afternoon, a little section in your book that talks about this very thing. It doesn't mention the Rolling Stones or Jerry Lee Lewis, but it mentions Elvis's influence from like rhythm and blues and how rock and roll transcended, you know, culture and race. And so, yeah, and that's an interesting question, 73. Okay, let's go to 75. Betty Friedan is best known for her A, efforts to organize immigrant workers, surprise election to the Senate, criticism of traditional gender roles, support for early childhood education, opposition to the Vietnam War. Does anybody have, go ahead, Deb.
Criticism of traditional gender roles?
Correct. Anybody know the name of the book? Betty Friedan is famous, usually credited with kind of accelerating the feminist movement. You know, I mean, in the 1970s in particular, there was this movement amongst women to kind of, to obtain equal rights. You know, so long in American history, women, you know, were paid lower wages for the same work. And Friedan's book was called The Feminine Mystique. right? The feminine mystique, and that book was like quintessential to the feminist movement of the 1970s. And then go to 74. Now, I looked over this test today, and it seems to me that this is the most recent question on the practice test. Now, I don't know. I looked it over once. I didn't look it over carefully, but it seems to me Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. He was overwhelmingly re-elected in 1984. So he served from 1981 to 1989. So this question really can, virtually be about the, the 1980s. I know that kids have told me there have been questions about Bill Clinton. There have been questions about Jimmy Carter. Well, obviously, Jimmy Carter's before that, but Bill Clinton, George H. Bush, George W. Bush, and I wouldn't be surprised even possibly Obama. But, I mean, on this practice test, this is it, So anyways, one of the goals of Reaganomics was to encourage private investment through tax cuts for businesses and the wealthy, redistribute income to the bottom fifth of wage earners, reduce the United States nuclear arsenal, restrict immigration from Mexico, outsource the United States manufacturing to Asian countries. Does anybody in here have absolutely no idea what the answer to that is? What would you do?
I would take the best educated guess.
What would that be?
I would probably say,
You can do this.
I would say probably either B or D.
No.
Now, let's D is a reasonable one. B is not. Reagan was reinvigorated conservative ideology, and Reaganomics would be comparable to Hamilton's ideology about trickle-down economics. Remember we talked about Hamilton and funding at par and assumption, and how Hamilton thought that if you did that and it benefited the wealthy, it would trickle down to the average person. It was criticism of Reagan where people called Reagan's ideas trickle-down economics. So if you look at that, to some extent, that's what A says. A is the correct answer. Encourage private investment through tax cuts for businesses and the wealthy. Reagan advocated for tax reductions to encourage, people to invest, particularly the wealthy, and he, was argued that would trickle down into the rest of the people. Okay. Now, so I don't even know. I wonder how many we've done. Has anybody kept track of the ones we've done only? No, you've done other ones. So I'm going to try, because I think I have, somehow. And I look at the first page, and I think we did everything on the first page. No. And we might not have done 6 or 2. Maybe we haven't done them all. All right. Well, we'll keep working on them. We'll keep working on them. Now, if you have your books, if you have this book, it's page 39. 39, term 21, is the Tariff of Abominations. I think that's where we left off. I think we had gotten all the way up to kind of introducing the notion of tariffs, and I'm pretty sure that we had gotten into the Jackson administration, and we said there were a variety of issues in the Jackson administration, that Jackson had defeated Adams in 1828, he ascended to the presidency, and his ideology was this kind of fear that the power of government would be utilized or abused by a select few for their benefit, this idea of privilege. And we talked about, the actions that he took, like rotation in office and things like that may have been, or at least appeared to be rooting out privilege. Now, the issue of nullification goes to the issue of states' rights versus the... Did it die?
Better call Garrett.
Did it die?
Garrett.
States? Oh, there it is. Oh, sorry. Wow. That's bad. States' rights versus...
Bad. I picked it off. Call Garrett with it.
There you go.
Oh. Let's see what
I don't know. It went dead and now it works, I guess.
Don't have that problem with.
I love this,
Yeah, no problem.
okay? All right. Yeah. Some interference. Okay. Well, anyways, I don't know if you can hear me or not. But I purchased this shirt. I stopped at the University of Missouri. I was out there. My son went to another college. I stopped at the University of Missouri. And I desperately wanted to buy a shirt that said University of Missouri, but everything in the bookstore said Mizzou. So I didn't even realize that's what they called the University of Missouri. So I'm thinking, geez, what is it? Where are we? You know. Then I bought it. I love this shirt. I have no connection to the University of Missouri except I drove through there and stopped at the bookstore, and it said Mizzou Golf. So anyways, I was mentioning that the issue of tariffs has to do with the issue of states' rights. You know, how much authority should the federal government have, and how much authority should the states have? And this kind of conflict between the states and the federal government had a kind of a lengthy history. You know, kind of starting with, well, I don't say starting with, but you know, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions is really the genesis of nullification. Now, what was the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions a response to? You want me to use that now?
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think happened with this?
I'm not sure.
All right. What do you think the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions was what was the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions a response to? Does anybody remember? This is before this time period. It's before the nullification crisis. So the nullification crisis starts in 1829. And it's in response to, you know, nullification is ignited as a result of a dispute over surveying and selling Western lands, right? I mean, we talked about this. We said, look, Senator Foote of Kentucky proposed a moratorium on the surveying of Western lands, and Senator Benton of Missouri protested that, and that dispute eventually got into a dispute as to whether or not states could nullify actions of Congress. But this notion that states had the final say over whether or not a piece of federal legislation was consistent with the Constitution is introduced as a part of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And my question to you is, what were the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions a response to? They were in 1797 and 1798. Does anybody remember what they were a response to? Thinking back. Anybody at all? Fisher, do you recall?
No.
Sam, do you recall? Alexanders, you do not recall. Cassandra, you do not recall. Would it be the Alien and Sedition Acts? Right? The Alien and Sedition Acts were passed by the Adams administration. And remember, Jefferson and Madison, responding to the Alien and Sedition Acts, said that, look, ultimately state legislatures could declare actions of Congress to be unconstitutional if they believed they were inconsistent with, their interpretation of the Constitution. Well, if we go fast forward to 1829, the South was increasingly disturbed with, the North and the West support of tariffs. And they saw these tariffs as being kind of deleterious to their interests. And in response to the Tariff of Abominations in 1828, John C. Calhoun wrote the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. And in the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, Calhoun argued that states could declare acts of Congress unconstitutional if they called a special convention debated the issue, and then after the delegates to that convention would vote, they could declare an act of Congress to be unconstitutional. Now, if nullification would have ever been established or passed, then some, like Daniel Webster, argued that the Constitution would be a rope of sand. Right? The Constitution, the federal government would have no power. The states would be able to declare anything that they saw fit to be inconsistent with the Constitution. And so this debate over nullification becomes an important one in determining the power of the national government over the power of state governments. Now, ultimately, what state actually does it and why? What state actually nullifies an act of Congress and why? Does anybody recall? Janet, do you recall what state actually did it and why?
South Carolina.
South Carolina actually nullified a revision to the Tariff of Abominations, right, in 1832. Now, what did Jackson do in response to that? Yes, go, Jim.
Did he create the Force Act?
He had Congress pass the Force Act, right, which would have enabled him to use force to enforce the tariffs. Now, how was eventually the issue resolved? You know, Jackson is not going to send force to South Carolina, right? He doesn't send troops there, but the issue is resolved. Does anybody remember? Oh, goodness, Alan, we're so... People were talking. They were hoping you'd show, right? Does anybody remember how it was resolved? Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, South Carolina nullifies the force bill.
Eventually, you are correct. South Carolina nullified the force bill. But prior to that, remember, there was a tariff compromise. Tariffs were lowered, right? Henry Clay orchestrated a tariff compromise that lowered tariffs, and the South Carolinians accepted that, but they nullified the force bill. So the issue of whether or not a state could nullify actions of Congress, or whether or not a state could do the ultimate, expression of states' rights, and that's secede from the Union, is not resolved. Is not resolved by nullification. Now, okay. So we have the Tariff of Abominations, we have nullification, we're in the Jackson administration. Now, in the Jackson administration, or I should say, after the War of 1812, and the War of 1812 ends in 1814, so starting in 1815, well, I shouldn't say starting, in the immediate aftermath of the war, through 1860, the beginning of the Civil War, we call that period the antebellum period, the period before the war. And it is characterized by a lot of things. One of the things that's characterized by is the emergence of a market economy, a significant national market economy. And frequently this is called the market revolution. The market revolution. And what happens in the market revolution is that people, instead of producing for themselves, right, and their families, and trading within their communities, they begin to specialize, companies specialize, workers specialize in producing products that are going to be sold more broadly. So part of the market revolution is kind of a loss of self-sufficiency, right? People become dependent upon one another. And the market is connected by a transportation revolution. Now, the AP loves the transportation revolution of this period. What were the three big transportation kind of, I don't want to call them innovations, but the three big ways that transportation improved and proliferated during this time period, connecting generally the East and the West? Yes, Alexander. The biggest is railroads, but in addition to railroads, before railroads, canals. What was the most famous canal, of course? Erie Canal, 1817. is when the Erie Canal, I think, is begun. I'm pretty sure it's completed in the 1820s. The Erie Canal is entirely in what state? Yes, go to
New York.
It's entirely in New York. Remember, no one but myself knew what two cities it connected? Right? Alan, do you recall now? Blasted Alan, blasted Fisher.
Buffalo and Albany?
Correct, Buffalo and Albany. The other transportation innovation would be roads. Actual paved roads, turnpikes, etc. The cult of domesticity is connected to that. The cult of domesticity is connected to that because, as a result of the market revolution, industrialization, the growth of industry that occurs at this time, people working for wages in larger numbers, right? There started to be a separation between home and work. Now, we talked about this. I mean, we talked about this when we talked about industrialization after, the Civil War. But industrialization, urbanization, and westward expansion starts now. Right? I mean, it starts, when I say now, it starts in the aftermath of the War of 1812. It is certainly interrupted and accelerated a little bit by the Civil War, but it's happening here. And so the difference between home and work starts to emerge, and when it does, women are considered to be kind of the matrons of home. The cult of domesticity is this idea that the woman is in charge of the house, and that their job is to provide a safe haven for the man and to raise the children, and the man goes off to work, and the woman is put on a pedestal, the cult of domesticity. Now, the 24th term also deals with women, and that's the Lowell System. We spoke nothing of this in class. I don't know if I mentioned this at all, but the earliest factories in America were textile mills, right? And they were located largely in New England. So when manufacturing starts in the United States, I know we mentioned this, it is textile manufacturing largely in New England. Now, Lowell becomes famous for a system of labor. And that is the Lowell factories. The Lowell factory hired young, we didn't mention this, young unmarried women, girls ages 16 to 22 or 23, to work in these factories for a period of time. The Lowell girls would get jobs as factory workers in these mills for a year, for 2, for 3. They were boarded in dormitories. They were seen by house matrons who would keep an eye on them, right? And they would work there to earn a dowry so that when they got married, they could present that to their husbands, right? So that the Lowell girl, there's a big discussion about this, a big discussion about whether this was oppressive to women or it provided women with opportunities. Women working, women out of the house, women earning money, but they're kind of, parentalistically kind of overseen. So there's a lot of discussion about the Lowell system. Now, all of the things that are happening in this antebellum period result in some level of change, right? They represent change. And the response to that change is an age of reform. Now, I don't think that there are any reforms on here. There are not. But we talked about that. And also, so we'll come back to that, the reforms of that time period, temperance and the anti-slavery movement, etc. But the utopian movement was a part of that as well. With this rapidly changing society kind of influencing people and their worlds changing, what do? Well, some people said, we got to fix things, right? So we're going to try to limit alcohol consumption and fix all of these other problems, treat the mentally ill better, and we're going to do all of these reforms. We're going to try to abolish slavery, so there's this flourishing reforms. And other people said, no, what we're going to do is kind of model to society how people should live and interact, and that's the utopian. The utopian vision is of a perfect society. And the example of a utopian experiment would be Brook Farm. And Brook Farm is famous because Hawthorne was there, right? Hawthorne was there. Other intellectuals went to Brook Farm, to live and to work, to dig and to write, and this was thought to be, an experiment in how people should live. Well, in addition to kind of, industrialization and urbanization, the 1840s also saw a rapid increase in immigration. Remember, the 1840s represented the largest percentage immigration in American history. Not in actual people, but as a percent of the population, the largest was the 1840s. And of course, the people who came in 1840s were generally two groups. Who remembers? Sam, do you recall? Irish and the other? Germans. The Germans and the Irish came in large numbers. The Irish represented a novel immigrant group. They were, in fact, from Northern and Western Europe, which is true, but they were the first group of people to come that was just utterly, they came in large numbers, they were utterly impoverished, and they were entirely Roman Catholic. And Catholicism was something that people resented and feared. It was a Protestant country, and people feared Catholicism, they resented Catholicism, and so the large Irish Catholic immigration generates a backlash, and the nativism, or nativist, is somebody who wants America for Americans, right? So that we want the United States to be preserved for who we perceive to be Americans. And it's not the Irish, right, in the 1840s. And it probably isn't the Germans. And it's certainly no one that's Catholic or Orthodox or Jewish. So America for Americans is the nativist backlash. Anybody remember the name of the party that emerges, political party that's based on nativism, that emerges in this time period? Yes, the Know-Nothings, or the American Party. Remember, that political party is going to be the first one to replace the Whigs that disintegrate in the Whigs disintegrate in 1852. Now, term 28 is manifest destiny. Manifest destiny. So now, there's a lot of things happening in the antebellum period. The market revolution, industrialization, the growth of cities, westward expansion, transportation revolution, reform movements are going on, lots of things happening. Utopian experiments are being tried. Now, this notion of manifest destiny is going to kind of capture the country in the 1840s. Right? Remember, Harrison is elected to the presidency in 1840. He is the first Whig to be elected to the presidency. So Harrison is elected to the presidency in 1840. He dies in 1841. Tyler, who was also a Whig in name only, ascends to the presidency and is looking for an issue, because Tyler, remember, didn't hold traditional Whig ideas. But Tyler was looking for an issue that people would rally around. And the issue he chose was expansion, right? And there were a faction of people, largely Democrats, who believed that it was the destiny of the United States to expand its institutions, its values, its political systems, its religion from Atlantic to Pacific. The notion of manifest destiny is a part of what we might call American identity, right? The American identity is that we are great. And that justifies pushing the Native Americans off of their land, pushing the Mexicans off of their land, forcing the Canadians further north, battling with England or battling with Mexico to fulfill our manifest destiny. It is John O'Sullivan that coins that term in 1845. And it is manifest destiny that explains one of the big issues of the time, and that is the annexation of Texas. Now, my suspicion is there won't be much discussion on the AP test about, the Texas Revolution and Sam Houston and things of that nature. The big issues about the Mexican War and Texas, right? The big issue about Texas is the eventual Mexican War. Remember, Texas is an independent country in 1836. There are numerous opportunities for Texas to be annexed into the United States. In fact, it takes 3 tries for Texas, who wants to be part of the United States, to be annexed. And that there is significant opposition to Texas's annexation. Why? It seems inconsistent with, it's certainly inconsistent with manifest destiny, and it also seems inconsistent with prudence. Wouldn't it be prudent to annex such a vast territory into the country if most of the people that are there are Americans and want to be part of the United States? So why was it so controversial? Yes, go ahead, Jim.
Was it the balance of like slave states and free states?
So it had to do with slavery, right? So the annexation of Texas, raises the issue of slavery. It's for that reason that Jackson delays in even recognizing Texas. It's for that reason that Van Buren takes no action to annex Texas. And it's also for that reason that Tyler, who is a Southerner, is so intent on annexing Texas. And it also contributes to when Polk is elected in 44, his intention of annexing Texas. Because Texas had slaves, and if it entered the Union, it was going to enter the Union as a slave state. Those who increasingly feared the extension and the expansion of slavery were opposed to this. And, well, we'll talk about that in a second. Well, the annexation of Texas, to some extent, prompts the Mexican War. Now, I mean, in terms of the Mexican War, I don't think you really need to know much about the Mexican War besides that it appears, and I want to be less than patriotic, but it appears provoked by the United States. I mean, it seems like Polk provokes the Mexicans in order to get what? I mean, what's at the core of the Mexican War? I mean, Texas is annexed. I mean, Texas had been an independent country for 8 years, and yes, it is a border dispute over Texas that causes the problem. But Polk makes a move in response to a problem somewhere else. Yes?
Polk crosses the border to California.
Yes. What's at the core of it is California, if you remember. Polk had tried to negotiate to get California. The Mexicans had rejected that. And when they did, he maneuvered troops south of the Nueces, north of the Rio Grande. The Mexicans perceived that as being invaded, and they attacked, and that prompted the Mexican War. That was very brief, and resulted in what we call the Mexican Cession. And the Mexican Cession is the acquisition of that vast territory, right? That includes Texas and New Mexico. Well, Texas was already a part of it, but parts of New Mexico, Arizona, California. And the Mexican Cession is what starts the sequence of events that leads to the Civil War, right? I mean, remember, Emerson says Mexico will poison us, right? Because now the dispute is what will come of the land that was annexed. Remember, many Northerners wanted slavery to be banned, wanted Congress to take action to ban slavery in the Mexican Cession. What was the name of the proviso that would have done that? Yes, the Wilmot Proviso would have done that. And remember, the proposal of the Wilmot Proviso exposes this issue of whether or not slavery should be allowed in the Mexican Cession. And many Northerners, didn't want it to be there. And then Southerners wanted slavery, felt that it was essential that slavery be allowed to spread there, so that they would have parity, and so that they would have a way of checking any action that they thought might be against their interest. The big fear that the South had was that the North would eventually dominate the House, dominate the Senate, dominate the Supreme Court, dominate the presidency, and then they would use the power of the national government to threaten the interests of the South, more specifically slavery. And so in order to prevent that from happening, slavery had to spread, right? Now remember, the North saw the spread of slavery as against their free labor ideology, right? You know, look, any place that slavery goes, free labor can't follow. And so Northerners believed it was crucial for the economic growth of the North to have an outlet in the West. So if people can't make it in the Northeast, if they can't get land or they can't make it in business, they can go west. But if slaves are there, they can't go there. And so to some extent, it is this free labor ideology rather than the morality of slavery that makes most Northerners intent on preventing slavery from spreading. Now, Northerners thought that Congress had the right to regulate slavery in the territories. Southerners thought that they did not. The compromise position was popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty suggested that, look, it's not a matter for Congress to decide. Right? It's not whether Congress can or can't, it's up to the people that go there. And remember, that notion of popular sovereignty is the idea that was clung to and stuck with by Stephen A. Douglas. The peculiar institution is a way that Southerners referred to slavery. And remember, we spent a lot of time, running up to the Civil War. Now, we're not doing too much with it here, because they basically, after I identify fire eaters, and these are the people that are in the South that are just absolutely convinced that the North is interested in destroying slavery and their way of life, which they saw associated with slavery. And the fire eaters were these people that pushed hard to protect slavery. And, eventually the fire eaters were the people that pushed for secession, right? But if you look at Term 31 and Term 32, the fire eaters are pushing for secession, right? Secession is what prompts the Civil War, but the Freedmen's Bureau is after the Civil War. So we just, from 31 to 32, skip the entire Civil War. The whole run-up to the Civil War and the Civil War itself. Typically on the multiple choice part of the test, there aren't very many battle questions. If there are, they are usually questions of significance. Like, what's the significance of the Battle of Antietam? I would think, even though Gettysburg is so darn interesting, Mr. Keene spent 7 days speaking of Gettysburg. Or no, let's see, 4 days talking about Gettysburg? That seems like an awful long time, doesn't it? 4 days? It is really fun, to talk about Gettysburg, and it's a really interesting, battle, and it's very dramatic. Probably Antietam is more significant because that's the high water mark. It's not really the high water mark geographically, but it is the best opportunity for the South to be successful. If they win in the fall of '62, in what eventually is the Battle of Antietam, then everything turns. Public opinion turns, British recognition turns, abolition hadn't been put on the table yet, because remember, up until Antietam, the North was fighting the war to save the Union, specifically not to free the slaves. So probably that's the one I might know, the Battle of Antietam. Now, the aftermath of the war presents a number of problems, and the biggest of those problems is, what do you do with 4 million ex-slaves that have no money, no education, and little knowledge of taking care of themselves in the context of the economy and society that they lived in? Moreover, you had a decimated South that was basically in rubble, whose infrastructure was destroyed. What do you do about them? What do you do about those 4 million freed men, as they were called? The government's response, Congress's response, the Republicans' response, was to create the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau was a crude relief agency to provide relief to the people in the African Americans that had been liberated. The Freedmen's Bureau, Otis Howard was the head of the Freedmen's Bureau. But remember, it was an example of something that white Southerners deeply resented. From the very beginning, once the slaves were freed, the white South was going to maintain that they had lost the war. They weren't sorry that they fought the war. They were sorry that they lost, and the status and condition of the African Americans in the South was their business. They assert that when they get the chance. Under Lincoln and Johnson, the ex-Confederate states are given great latitude in reconstructing themselves. We call that presidential reconstruction. When they had that latitude, remember, every single one of them passed laws to relegate African Americans in their states to second-class citizenship, right? And those laws were called the Black Codes. What's the difference between the Black Codes? Is Jim Crow on here? No. What's the difference between the Black Codes and Jim Crow laws? They both deal with African Americans. Does anybody know? Remember we talked about the Black Codes. Those Black Codes were passed when the white South had an opportunity to relegate the status of African Americans. They were given that by Lincoln and by Johnson in presidential reconstruction. They put very little demands on white Southerners in terms of their reconstruction. Now, when those little demands were put on them, they passed the Black Codes. What were the Jim Crow laws? Anybody? Go ahead.
The Jim Crow laws separated races?
Yes.
The Black Codes kept black people underneath.
Now, and the Jim Crows are later, right? The Black Codes are what's repealed. The Black Codes are repealed basically by the 14th Amendment. The Jim Crow laws are passed after the North gives up on Reconstruction. And the Jim Crow laws are those laws that segregate the South, right? That provide for that social segregation. The Jim Crow laws last until the 1960s. It is the civil rights movement of the 1960s that addresses the Jim Crow laws. Now, back to Reconstruction. Eventually, the Black Codes, among other things, disenchants the white North with Reconstruction in the South, and presidential Reconstruction gives way to what we call radical or Republican or congressional Reconstruction. Congressional or radical Reconstruction. In congressional or radical Reconstruction, a coalition of the freed slaves, scallywags who were white Southerners who supported radical Reconstruction, and carpetbaggers who were white Northerners who had come to the South to participate in its Reconstruction in government. A coalition of these three groups formed state governments in the ex-Confederate states that supported Republican ideology. Remember, these governments are not going to last for long. Congressional Reconstruction or radical Reconstruction is this marvelous experiment that doesn't last for long. What's the symbol of the white South's response to radical Reconstruction? Somebody will get this. Yes. The Ku Klux Klan. How was the Ku Klux Klan that started then during Reconstruction different from the renewed Klan that dominated the 1920s? Go ahead.
The new Klan was a response to all the modern Jews and stuff that attacked traditional values.
Alan, that's a very thoughtful answer. Very impressed. That's exactly right. You know, the new Klan was a response to all the things that were changing in the 1920s. The original Klan was an attempt to overthrow those regimes. Right? Now, the Klan is successful. All the radical regimes. What election ends radical Reconstruction? Anybody remember what election? Ricky, do you remember what election? You do not. Cassandra, do you remember what election? Son of a gun. Tristan? Oh, blasted, yes.
Was it 76?
It was 76. Right? It was 76. So it was the election of 1876. Who was elected? Good, Alexander. Hayes. And Hayes agreed. Remember, it was the contested election called the Compromise of 77. Hayes agreed, and the Republicans agreed if Hayes would be president, they would withdraw troops from the South. And that ends Reconstruction. Now, in the aftermath of Reconstruction, we said over the next several years, the status and condition of African Americans, deteriorates. Most African Americans are caught up in sharecropping. And sharecropping was an arrangement to lease land from white landowners for a share of the crop. Sometimes it's called tenancy, right? Like you're a tenant, tenancy, right? Or sharecropping. And we said in addition to sharecropping, most African Americans were politically disenfranchised, meaning that they were pushed out of voting, and they were socially segregated with Jim Crow laws. Now, with the South kind of moving in its own direction, there are numerous issues that the country faces in that period that we call the Gilded Age, right? And you can kind of see those issues in term 38, 39, 40, 41, and even 42, right? Those 5 terms all refer to the issues that emerge in the Gilded Age. Now, the Gilded Age is generally considered to be the time period between 1865 and 1900. And it is a time period where the changes that started in the aftermath of the War of 1812 come to fruition. Urbanization, industrialization, westward expansion, all of those things come to fruition. By 1920, more people are living in the cities than in the countryside. The industrial sector of the United States is the largest in the world. Most people are working for wages, right? Those things are, this transformation is occurring in this time period. Now, as that transformation occurs, there are issues. The big issue prior to this time is the extension and expansion of slavery and slavery itself. After the Compromise of 77, to some extent that issue is resolved. Now, because African Americans are basically abandoned, and really the issue of the status and condition of African Americans isn't really renewed until the modern civil rights movement starting in the late 1950s. But if you look here at term 38, that term greenback refers to currency that is not backed by gold or silver. And one of the big issues of the Gilded Age was the nature of the money supply in banking. And remember, there were agrarian interests that wanted to expand the size of the money supply. And the greenback was one way to do it. But the way that came to dominate that, what was the big issue that the agrarian interests, those that wanted currency inflation, rallied around? It wasn't really greenbacks, yes?
Unlimited coinage of silver at 1801.
The free and unlimited coinage of silver at 1801. And Tristan, what was the political candidate that we talked about being associated with the Scopes trial that really came to embody that notion? He's not a candidate until 1896. Go ahead, sir. William Jennings Bryan. Now, the other issue that is a big one in this time period is the growth of big business, industry and big business. And that jumped down to term 41. The trust is a method of establishing a monopoly. So what happens in this time period is that you need big businesses in order to produce, to manufacture mammoth amounts of product. In doing so, what happens is these businesses tend to dominate competition. And one of the methods of controlling competition is this legal, notion called the trust. What famous kind of entrepreneur of the era is most associated with controlling competition, monopolizing, and the trust? Go ahead, sir.
Rockefeller?
Yes, Rockefeller. What was his industry? Yes.
Standard Oil.
Standard Oil of Ohio, or oil in general. Now, obviously, this huge accumulation of wealth that's associated with these big trusts and monopolies and major industries is going to result in conflicts between these owners and workers. Now, you may remember that during our class, we spoke extensively about the labor movement. I don't know if you remember, we joined in this room. I mean, when you think about it, when you reminisce about coming down to this room and viewing the river ran red, gripping is the only thing I could think of.
I'm still seeing last night.
Yeah, you can't, you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about storming the banks of the Monongahela. But the Yellow Dog contract was just one of many ways that companies attempted to undermine workers forming unions, right? You know, the workers' response to the confusion of industrialization, the workers' response to the dehumanization of work, you know, to the mundane work, to the variation of wages, the ups and downs, was to try to join together. Remember we said they all did it. The farmers did it in the Populist Party, the businesses did it with the trust, and the workers did it with labor unions. The businesses fought those labor unions in various ways. You know, workers went on strike, they implored, you know, government to come and put down those strikes. But the Yellow Dog contract was an agreement that if you joined a union, you would be fired, right? And the Yellow Dog contract was something that was utilized by companies to stop unionization. 42 is patronage, another issue of the time. And we talked about that the other day. We talked about patronage, you know, when we talked about Jackson. And we said, well, look, you know, when Jackson started this rotation in office, eventually the idea of rewarding your friends and supporters with government jobs explodes to the point where Garfield is assassinated by a disgruntled office worker, or a disgruntled office seeker. Congress responds with the Civil Service Act, or the Pendleton Act, in 1884. Let's turn the page. Let's just do one more. Okay. Now, 43 takes us to the city. And so, if you remember our conversation about the Gilded Age, we did a lot with the growth of big business, industrialization, the labor movement, and then after that we went to urbanization. And in talking about urbanization, we talked about the push and the pull and what pushed people off the lands where they were and out of Europe, and the pull, the lure, excitement, the economic opportunities in cities. You know, we talked about all of that. We talked about at length immigration. Old immigration, new immigration, you know, old immigrants. Where were the old immigrants in the Gilded Age from, incidentally? The old immigrants from, we said, old, new, first and second wave. The old immigrants, what part of Europe? Sabrina, do you remember?
Was that like Italy?
That was the new. That was the second wave. Our people, yes.
Is it just northern, western?
Northern and western. Second wave was southern and eastern. Italy's in that southern and eastern, you know, wave of. Although the northern Italians may have been to some extent in the first wave, but the southern Italians were in the second. Right? So we talked about old, new immigration. And the big thing eventually, Alan, we concluded is that all these people flocked to cities. So there were problems in cities. There were problems with government. There were problems with all these immigrants. There were problems in cities. And one of the problems was housing. And we talked about dumbbell tenements. Was this kind of the solution? Crowding people into these dumbbell tenements, you know, the solution. And one of the things that we argued, and I'll conclude with this, is that the problems of urban America are significant. Oh, what was the name of the Danish journalist that writes the book in 1890 that becomes kind of the quintessential expression of illustrating the problems of the cities? Yes. Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S. Name of the book, anybody? Kevin? Darn, blasted Kevin. Anna Marie? Janet? How the Other Half Lives. And that, you know, exposes all the problems of the cities, the tenement houses, the dumbbell tenements. Eventually, and I promise we'll conclude with this, eventually the big kind of response to that, these problems, is the rise of political bossism. You know, the bosses provide crude social service. What's the name of the most famous boss, incidentally? Yes?
Boss Tweed.
Boss Tweed, what city?
New York.
New York. All right, we'll stop there. It's almost, it's 27 after. We'll start with the social gospel. Now, when we come back, next Monday, we gotta finish them all. Can we do it, Jay? Can we do it? We gotta finish them all next month. Oh, we did a lot. Now, when we meet tomorrow, we come tomorrow after school, we'll go back to a more detailed review of what we were talking about. You know, I think we're talking about, I don't know, Hamilton or something. I'll look it up tomorrow.